Since the foundation of psychopathology, the study of mental illness, there has been one disturbing and recurrent trend of human history: the desire to label that which is perceived as wrong by one demographic, often those in power but not always, as a form of psychopathology. Again, this is not something any one group is solely guilty of doing. I, a member of the secular community, have seen this attempted with religion. I've seen people with no understanding of mental illness beyond what they've seen on TV make a few spurious links and thus proudly declare that religion must be a form of psychopathology. Now, whilst in that specific instance its impact will likely be relatively small, perhaps pissing off the one or two religious people present, effectively halting any chance of a discussion in good faith, there are times where doing this has a greater impact outside of generally reinforcing mental health stigma. This, of course, leads me to today's topic, so-called rapid onset of gender dysphoria. But first, let's travel back to the 1960s. In the year 1961, only 5 years after the discovery that a typical human had 46 chromosomes, a group of scientists first described the intersex condition known as XYY syndrome, in which carriers present with an extra Y karyotype. Naturally, there was an interest in the effects this extra Y had on the individual, so people began to investigate. Sadly, through a lack of ethics and shoddy methodology, soon the idea that people with XYY chromosomes were more aggressive than those who lacked the extra Y chromosome began to make the rounds. Then came along Mary Telfer. Now, I need to be clear, Mary is not the originator of the XYY aggression myth, which was already alive by this point. No, what she did was give the media a name that they could latch onto. She dubbed those with the XYY syndrome as super males, blending together ideas as benign as acne scars with the genetic disposition to becoming a mass murderer. The media found out about her term and ran with it, drawing spurious links between various murderers and even outright lying in claiming to know that specific killers had the syndrome. By the year 1968, in which Michael Court Brown published the first review article in the Journal of Medical Genetics and found there to be zero basis for the overrepresentation of XYY individuals in prison for criminal acts, violent or not, concluding that the original studies had likely been guilty of selection bias, it was far too late. The genie had been let out of the bottle, and the media ate it up. In 1969, an article was published by the American Psychiatric Association, which found that, quote, "While a more extensive and thorough study of this new minority group is needed, it now appears that in general the XYY male has been falsely stigmatized. The frequency of his involvement in antisocial behavior and crime may not be appreciably different from that of the average citizen." End quote. To her credit, it should be noted that Mary Telfer was part of said research team. But whilst the science had discovered its mistake, the stigma did not end. The syndrome was still discussed at various levels throughout society, even entering discourse on race and violence. It was referenced in the 1992 film Alien 3, which was set on a prison planet. Most surprisingly, however, upon talking to my partner, I learned that this is still being taught as a fact in biology when she was at school. But it also survived in another form. It acted as a cautionary tale for all budding social science students. It taught us the importance of avoiding premature conclusions and the power of giving a phantom condition a name. In 2017, a story began making the rounds online about how a researcher by the name of Lisa Littman had published an article discussing a new condition. The condition in question was referred to as Rapid-Onset Gender Dysphoria, or ROGD for short. The truth was that she presented preliminary results at a conference which had been summarized in the accompanying journal. In it, Littman noted that groups of parents online were discussing their surprise when their child came out as transgender post-puberty. There were also a variety of other claims noted surrounding said adolescents coming out. One was the way in which said parents made assertions about other adolescents and young adults in the same peer group apparently coming out in a similar fashion. Another thing parents noted was a sudden increase in online consumption of trans-focused media. Now, to study this, Littman would continue to conduct a 90-question anonymous survey, which had been posted to a total of 3 websites, at the time unnamed, that were known to discuss said topics. The surveys were targeted at parents who claimed to have a child displaying rapid-onset gender dysphoria, which raised a number of concerns about the methodological integrity of said research. One of those issues supplied by human rights activist Zinnia Jones was the total lack of operationalization, converting concepts or terms into an empirical standard which can be measured. Zinnia noted that the definition offered in the preliminary report, which read as, quote, "Parents online are observed reporting their children experiencing a rapid onset of gender dysphoria appearing for the first time during or after puberty," end quote, really failed to distinguish itself from the already existing principles found in the current understanding of gender dysphoria. For example, the DSM-5 had already noted the following as early as 2013. Quote, "Late-onset gender dysphoria occurs around puberty or much later in life. Some of these individuals report having had a desire to be of the other gender in childhood that was not expressed verbally to others. Others do not recall any signs of childhood gender dysphoria. For adolescent males with late-onset gender dysphoria, parents often report surprise because they did not see signs of gender dysphoria during childhood." End quote. Now, some may say that this was simply Littman using rapid-onset gender dysphoria as synonymous with late-onset gender dysphoria, sometimes referred to as adolescent-onset gender dysphoria, but Littman herself suggested otherwise in her preliminary report with, quote, "The purpose of this study is to document this observation and describe the resulting presentation of gender dysphoria inconsistent with existing research," end quote. This was a point further substantiated in 2018 when the full report was published, including the line that, quote, "More research is needed to determine the incidence, prevalence, persistence, and desistance rates, and the duration of gender dysphoria for adolescent-onset gender dysphoria in general, and for rapid-onset gender dysphoria specifically," end quote. So how did the full report differentiate rapid-onset gender dysphoria from late-onset gender dysphoria? Well, it didn't. The only differences that seem to exist are the very subjective terms of rapid or sudden, which at no point does the study even attempt to quantify. Defining such terms is key when you're conducting an exploratory article. So why didn't Littman go ahead and do so? Personally, I think a large part of that has to do with the extra baggage inherent with the phrase rapid onset gender dysphoria and how it was being used in the very online forums Littman was on about as a means to delegitimize the experiences of transgender individuals. Littman's work seems to be a way of sneaking said assertions past the peer review process by linking them to a similarly defined yet very real phenomenon. I am of course on about the notions of social contagion and maladaptive response. To understand the baggage attached to rapid onset gender dysphoria, we must first of all understand where Littman sourced her ideas from. At the time of the preliminary report, Littman had not officially named the websites to which she'd posted her survey, though Zinnia Jones on the case quickly found 3 likely candidates: Fourth Wave Now, Transgender Trend, and Youth Trans Critical Professionals. When the full article was published, it turned out that not only had Zinnia been correct, but these 3 websites had been the only websites Littman had posted a survey to. The survey itself had consisted of 90 questions, of which out of the 274 respondents, 256 were used in the final analysis, each reporting to have had a child who came out as trans between the ages of 10 and 21. Out of those 256, a total of 195 stated that they did not accept the declared gender of their child, yet rather interestingly, 225 selected that they held the belief that, quote, "transgender people deserve the same rights and protections as others," end quote. Now I say rather interestingly due to the sources in question. Fourth Wave Now, Transgender Trend, and Youth Trans Critical Professionals are all websites centered around the organized harassment of human rights activists seeking to obtain and protect the very rights said people proclaimed to fully accept. As a specific example, Transgender Trend published resource packs intended for schools which attempted to justify the torture of transgender children for the exact same practices of so-called reparative or conversion therapy as has been and is still used on lesbian, gay and bisexual people to this day. Their only excuse was that there wasn't a consensus on the matter, since 1 or 2 individuals held to the torture's effectiveness. The lie here is exposed, of course, when one realizes that a consensus is not revoked on the whims of a couple of disgraced physicians who place personal prejudice before clinical trial. Indeed, the American Psychological Association, American Academy of Pediatrics, the UK Council for Psychotherapy, and the World Psychiatric Association stand unanimous in their condemnation of so-called reparative or conversion therapy. And these are but a few of the largest such medical institutions which, upon reviewing all evidence available, have reached a consensus that to deny it is to lay insult to reality. What these people attempted to forward in Pack's reminder, intended for schools, are a violation of human rights. So do forgive me if I seem a little cynical in stating that I see this as a calculated move designed to give the appearance of a false mid-ground and thus undeserved fairness. However, these are the people that Littman set out to study in attempts to, first of all, validate the existence of so-called rapid-onset gender dysphoria, as well as discuss Littman's hypotheses designed to explain what the data shows. And it's in this that we return to the aforementioned baggage. Littman offers us two hypotheses. Hypothesis 1. Social contagion is a key determinant of rapid-onset gender dysphoria. Hypothesis 2. Rapid-onset gender dysphoria is a maladaptive coping mechanism for adolescents and young adults. Now, the first thing I noticed upon reading these was the fact that Littman completely skips a step. Like, before we can begin to dissect rapid-onset gender dysphoria, surely we must define it in a clinical sense, demonstrate it to exist, and only then investigate it. Because currently, there's hypothesis 3. What was being reported as rapid-onset gender dysphoria was not an accurate description of what actually occurred. And this is by far the most likely explanation, given the current evidence of the current scientific consensus when held up to Littman's choice in method and sample. And this has been one of the major issues taken with the study. The fact that it presents rapid-onset gender dysphoria as a genuine condition distinct from late-onset gender dysphoria on nothing more than the words of a heavily biased sample. The conclusion of Littman's article states, quote, "Rapid-onset gender dysphoria describes a phenomenon where the development of gender dysphoria is observed to begin suddenly during or after puberty in an adolescent or young adult who would not have met the criteria for gender dysphoria in childhood. Rapid-onset gender dysphoria appears to represent an entity that is distinct in etiology from the gender dysphoria observed in individuals who have previously been described as transgender. It is possible that rapid-onset gender dysphoria represents an egosynotic, maladaptive coping mechanism for some adolescents and young adults, and that peer group and online influences may contribute to its development. It is unknown whether the gender dysphoria of rapid-onset gender dysphoria is temporary or likely to be long-term. The elevated number of friends per friendship group who became transgender identified, the pattern of cluster outbreaks of transgender identification in these friendship groups, the substantial percentage of friendship groups where the majority of the members became transgender identified, and the peer group dynamics observed all serve to support the plausibility of social and peer contagion of rapid-onset gender dysphoria. The worsening of mental well-being and parent-child relationships, and behaviours that isolate teens from their parents, families, non-transgender friends, and mainstream sources of information are particularly concerning. More research is needed to better understand rapid-onset gender dysphoria, its implications, and scope." End quote. Note how nowhere in the conclusion is the existence of rapid-onset gender dysphoria even questioned or doubted. Only the auxiliary points display any such consideration, and even then, they still overstate the study's validity. Why? Well, because how can you hope to even begin to investigate what's apparently a complex psychological phenomenon without ever having talked to the person that's supposedly affected by said phenomenon? What's more is, how can you argue that a sample with clear hostility to the very existence of transgender people is a valid and unbiased sample when it comes to investigating a phenomenon that could undermine the existence of at least a segment of the trans community? The truth is you cannot. You may as well approach anti-vaxxers about their personal opinions on vaccines and its relation to autism. Of course they do said opportunity to assert that vaccines cause autism outbreaks, and I'm sure if you ask them the question, do you hold to the scientific method, they would answer yes, but they very clearly don't. The sad thing is, I don't think Littman's study was ever intended to do anything else. As noted, there is nothing new about rapid-onset gender dysphoria when compared to late-onset gender dysphoria, even though Littman repeatedly asserts there is. Why? Well, because the community she sourced the very idea of rapid-onset gender dysphoria from can now use her study to claim that rapid-onset gender dysphoria is a genuine condition accepted in science, and through that they can sneak in their extra baggage, the two hypotheses noted in the study. It's true, Littman notes the fact that said hypotheses currently lack basis in the article. But the wording of the conclusion isn't explicit in noting such, and that's without considering that fourth wave now, transgender trend, and youth trans critical professionals are not attempting to have a scientific discussion on the matter. As evidenced earlier, these sites are designed to spread misinformation to stall and even strip back transgender rights through any means necessary. Their target audience is not academic, it's general. Aware of this fact, they can utilize this article as a justification for their anti-science views in the exact same way the anti-vaxxer movement utilizes the long discredited Andrew Wakefield study to this day. But it goes deeper than that. Why do you fight God if he doesn't exist? It's a question I get a lot on this channel, and it seems to draw from a certain fallacy a lot of people are susceptible to. We tend to think of ourselves as perfectly rational beings when we're really not. One of the oddities of human behaviour is a way in which criticism can be seen as validating of the original claim. And I don't mean surviving criticism in the sense that we tested a piece of knowledge and it held fast. I mean people outright see any attempts at criticism, no matter how damaging, to only prove that the original statement must be true. Now there's another idea building on from this. The idea that a lie cannot hurt you and therefore to fear a lie is unreasonable. I think this was an idea best summed up by George R. R. Martin with the quote, "When you tear out a man's tongue, you are not proving him a liar. You're only telling the world that you fear what he might say." End quote. Now whilst this is pretty accurate, the reality is a lie can do a great deal of harm. And this is especially true for a lie which is platformed on what seems to be a credible source. This is one of the things that makes religion so dangerous, since it claims to come from the ultimate source. As a result, hundreds of millions have lost their lives to it over the millennia. A lie can be harmful, and attempts to challenge or suppress it are not validation of said lie. And yet that's the argument those in support of said study are currently making. Since its publishing, Littman's University, Brown University have retracted their news article, and the PLOS ONE team has begun a review of her study with the possibility of retraction. One thing a lot of people don't know about PLOS ONE is that, whilst it's a peer-reviewed journal, it doesn't really look into the conclusions made by the article's author. It mostly reviews the way in which the method is written up to ensure that it is at least replicable. This is part of their quantity over quality approach to science publishing. And whilst a person who genuinely believes that article to have good methodology that supports its conclusions would welcome further scrutiny of said research, those who support the article are up in arms over the whole process. They're claiming that what Brown University did, and PLOS ONE are currently in the process of doing, is nothing more than self-censoring to appease the trans cabal. Because apparently further review of the science is the most unscientific thing one could do, which is stunningly short-sighted for many of the same people, as they're often the ones arguing that what Littman did was virtuous because she was reviewing the scientific consensus at the time. So reviewing the science is good, unless you're reviewing the science, in which case it's bad. Fact is, this of course echoes what we see with the anti-vax movement surrounding Wakefield. In light of his failure to declare conflict of interest and diabolical methodology, the anti-vax movement rushed in to claim that they were the victim of the establishment, effectively turning them into a martyr. Now in the exact same vein, the very websites from which Littman sourced her data are now claiming that the trans cabal has the power to silence entire journals, while still having to jump through dehumanizing hoops just to get a GP referral. Because consistency is apparently for beta cucks or something of that sort. However, whilst Littman's paper in no way does what these groups are pretending it does, these parents are witnessing something that they're reporting back as being rapid-onset gender dysphoria. So I'm going to take this opportunity to discuss a number of things I've wanted to talk about in the past, but never really felt I had the chance. So let's take a look at the skeletons in the closet. The thing that immediately spoke out to me upon reading Littman's article and the way in which he presented rapid-onset gender dysphoria was the way in which the rapid or sudden aspects had a completely mundane explanation that's been well established for decades. What parents were witnessing wasn't a sudden change in who their child was. It was them reaching a point where they felt the need to come out to their family, whether it be out of a sense of comfort, obligation, or simple desperation. The study, in effect, was trying to do something I'd seen attempted countless times with sexuality, but on some quasi-scientific level to give itself the appearance of having some level of legitimacy. We were witnessing the pathologization of coming out. To understand this better, let us look at the two hypotheses the article forwards. The two hypotheses offered by Littman build on the unfounded claims made by the parents she surveyed. Hypothesis 1. Social contagion is a key determinant of rapid-onset gender dysphoria. Hypothesis 2. Rapid-onset gender dysphoria is a maladaptive coping mechanism for adolescents and young adults. Again, these are not something new. This is simply the repackaging of homophobic talking points as attempts to direct them at trans people. Hypothesis 1 doesn't differ in the slightest to the claim that allowing gay and bisexual people to live openly and teaching about their existence in class will infect heterosexual people and turn them gay and bisexual. Meanwhile, Hypothesis 2 is just the same old: gay people exist as a result of childhood trauma, such as rape, and therefore it's a symptom of said childhood trauma and should be treated as such. The usage of maladaptive really drives that home, as said term is often used to describe harmful attempts at coping, such as alcohol abuse. Therefore, Hypothesis 2 is not only attempting to suggest that being trans can result from trauma, but being trans is harmful. And yes, the article doesn't confirm these hypotheses. It does, however, draw back on them in the reflection, stating, quote, "The conclusion of this exploratory study is that clinicians need to be very cautious before relying solely on self-report when adolescents and young adults seek social, medical, or surgical transition. Adolescents and young adults are not trained medical professionals. When adolescents and young adults diagnose their own symptoms based on what they read on the internet and hear from their friends, it is quite possible for them to reach incorrect conclusions. It is a duty of the clinician, when seeing a new adolescent and young adult patient seeking transition, to perform their own evaluation and differential diagnosis to determine if the patient is correct or incorrect in their self-assessment of their symptoms and their conviction that they would benefit from transition." End quote. Now, there are several things that need addressing here. First is the fact that Littman notes this as a conclusion, but she never brings it up in her actual conclusion. That right there is highly dubious. It seems she wanted to forward her hypotheses as having more merit than she actually could declare in her actual conclusion, so was also doing so earlier. Second, it's forwarding that the opinions of parents who are also not trained professionals and certainly don't know what their child is going through are equal, if not superior, to the individual themselves. Third, it suggests that these specialists are not careful at the current and are simply running with the pure whims of the people referred to them. And that's how it's being used by those who partook in the study. The groups who are sourced don't separate rapid-onset gender dysphoria from the two hypotheses forwarded by Littman. To them, rapid-onset gender dysphoria is defined by social contagion and/or maladaptive response to abuse. And Littman's mockery of science in failing to differentiate rapid-onset gender dysphoria from our current understanding allows them to do so. Littman repeatedly asserts rapid-onset gender dysphoria to be a genuine phenomenon, and yet that very assertion is dependent on hypothesis 1 or 2 being correct. So Littman would have to validate said hypotheses before being able to honestly state that rapid-onset gender dysphoria is genuine. But she doesn't. That allows whoever wants to use this poorly constructed study to run off with it and use it as a political ace to harass human rights activists. Under social contagion, Littman even compares trans people to those suffering from anorexia, a common bigoted response that has no basis at all, yet is meant to harm human rights for trans people. Without actual study of the people in question, assessing the claims of the parents rather than taking their very clearly biased perspective as gospel, neither hypotheses, as well as the very condition they are attributed to, can be claimed to have any basis whatsoever. Because, let's be real, what do we actually have here, and are the two hypotheses Littman forwards the only or even the most likely explanations as to what's being reported? We ultimately have a group of parents hostile towards trans people, their rights, and their existence. That's the fundamental beliefs of the three websites which were the focus of the survey, completely voiding their attempts to present themselves as reasonable through answering that they agreed with trans rights. This is clear social desirability bias. We have these parents suddenly becoming aware that their adolescent or young adult child is trans. How does this differ in any way to a gay or bisexual person coming out? And yes, homophobic parents often argue that their child turned gay or bisexual overnight, sometimes making reference to past partners or no previous signs. But here's the thing. Children can pick up on latent hostility and learn to hide who they are to avoid ostracization. I am of course talking about being in the closet. This is a phrase that describes a well-documented occurrence, not only with sexuality and gender, but many things including beliefs. Suddenly becoming aware that someone is a certain way does not then mean we can ascertain that this is a change in that person. That's not a valid conclusion. At most, it's a change in the parent's knowledge. Let's take the example of online media designed to supply trans people with information that they are currently denied through poor education. How can said parents claim that their child all of a sudden started to consume said media unless they monitor their child 24/7? Clear browsing history exists. It's how my mum had no idea of my bisexuality, even though we only had a wired internet connection at the time I was figuring it out for myself. The only access I had to such media was my mum's laptop, and she had no clue when I finally came out to her about it. Once a child is out or coming out, however, why would they hide it? So the change isn't consumption of media, it's a change in simply no longer hiding said consumption of media. But that's not the only factor that was likely involved. We also have to acknowledge the fact that figuring out this stuff takes time, especially when you've been kept in the dark all your life. A trans person who has never had an accurate explanation of what being transgender is may never make the connection that this describes who they are. Secondary factors such as anxiety and depression stemming from gender dysphoria may take the spotlight, causing them to seek palliative cures rather than identify the underlying cause. This could all change, however, when they become aware of the existence of fellow trans people. This is especially true of people who go off to university or simply move around in life. However, that does not then mean that they weren't LGBT+ before. It just means that they were previously unaware of their gender or sexuality because they've been raised in a hetero and cis-normative world that does everything it can to try and force them to conform. It's what happened to me. I first realised my sexuality around 13 years of age, and my gender soon followed, though it took me far longer to come out about the latter. It wasn't until I met a fellow trans person and befriended them that I finally had someone I could confide in, and from there my strength grew. That's how confidence works. You nurture it, it grows. Which leads me onto another one of the observations these parents had apparently made, which Littman pushes in defense of her social contagion hypothesis. Quote, "One of the most compelling findings supporting the potential role of social and peer contagion in the development of rapid onset of gender dysphoria is the cluster outbreaks of transgender identification occurring in friendship groups. The expected prevalence of transgender young adult individuals is 0.7%. Yet more than a third of the friendship groups described in the study had 50% or more of the adolescents and young adults in the group becoming transgender identified in a similar time frame, a localized increase to more than 70 times the expected prevalence rate. This is an observation that demands urgent further investigation." End quote. For a start, I'd like to know how parents went about finding this out. Did they actually ask said friends, or did they just assume they were trans? But more importantly, I need to note once again that the children of said parents came out as trans between the ages of 10 and 21, with an average of 15.2. Now, most schools have several hundred students, if not more, a fact that typically increases into the tens of thousands as one enters college or university. My university had over 15,000 attendees, meaning that at 0.7% we could estimate 105 trans students were in attendance. But even a small school consisting of a couple hundred students would mean that it's not unreasonable for 2 or even more to be trans. Now, this wouldn't guarantee that they're friends or that they're even aware of one another. However, we need to acknowledge the existence of LGBT+ support groups. At university, all of my friends pretty much came from 3 different societies. There was the Atheist Humanist Secular Society, the Feminist Society, but the most important one to me was the LGBT+ Society. Again, I'm very curious about the methodology and how the parents estimated that over 50% of the friendship groups had turned trans, because how do they know how many friends their children have? Especially when it's adults, you don't meet every friend that your child has. My mum may have met 1 or 2, that's really it. So there's a major issue that needs to be considered there in how the fuck the parents know this. But to jump from 2 or more trans people coming out while supporting one another as friends to there being a contagion is a chasm too large to cover. And that's assuming that the 0.7% statistic is the actual prevalence of trans people throughout the adolescent population. If there's anything we've learned from lesbian, gay and bisexual history, it's that known numbers of stigmatized demographics seem to grow as society becomes less hostile and minority groups feel safer in coming forward to be counted. 0.7% is likely an underestimate. This is simply a result of said demographics no longer feeling as if they have to keep the reality of their existence hidden to protect themselves. And when one trans person in a specific area or school comes out, this may act to embolden others in that area to do the same, resulting in what looks like breakouts of being trans, when really we're seeing a breakout in confidence and support. In schools where one trans person takes that plunge, the 0.7% may be overrepresented in that school, but in another school where no trans person takes a plunge, that is underrepresented. Of course, this fact doesn't stop the bigots rushing forward to claim that the growing numbers of people feeling safe enough to come out is really the result of said sexuality and gender spreading like a disease. But that argument is just baseless. All evidence tells us that it's impossible to actively change a person's gender or sexuality. In all likelihood, being trans isn't as rare as we currently think, and we're starting to see a snowball effect of people inspired by the stories of others coming out, only to in turn inspire others. I reflected on my own experience of coming out at school. I say coming out, I was actually outed by a so-called friend I thought I could trust. Before that, nobody knew of anyone else in our school being LGBT+, and this was a school which had several years, and to those years had a couple hundred individuals to each year, and yet no one else had come out. A few months after I was outed, however, things started to change. Not in my own year, but in the years below me, suddenly I started hearing about this individual and that individual coming out, willingly coming out. People I had never talked to, let alone talked to about my sexuality. It seemed just my mere existence in being out, even if it was unwilling and there's a lot of horrific experiences I suffered as a result, emboldened some people to come out themselves, willingly. This is why representation matters. And unlike Littman's hypothesis, all of what I've stated here is based on past observations and first-hand accounts by LGBT+ people themselves, not the perceptions of some hate-fueled mob looking to abuse science to justify the abuse aimed at trans people. But focusing specifically on the second hypothesis, I have to be blunt. This psychoanalyzing of young trans people via talking to their parents makes me sick. So too does the way in which this is often parroted by feminism appropriating reactionary transphobes. The attempt to gaslight trans people into questioning their own sanity on the basis that they were once abused does not strike me as a particularly ethical or feminist thing to do. As someone who opened up about their childhood abuse, I have to live constantly not only with the impact of said abuse, but the way in which people attempt to poach my experience as a means to silence me. So I'm bisexual. That's because I have a broken understanding of love. So I'm an atheist. That's because I've come to hate God for what happened to me. So I'm trans. That's my attempts to cope with the memories I live with. I'm fucking sick and tired of such crap, especially from so-called researchers that can't be bothered to contact the person directly, but relies on the parent who rejects their child's very existence to even suggest that what they forward may be the case. And the responsibility for that falls firmly on Littman's shoulders. So in drawing this thing to a close, I already know that a number of people have likely commented under my video that Littman noted her study's limitations, be it in a rather obscure segment of her paper that wasn't made clear in the summarizing conclusion. I can also predict that I'll likely be told the way in which the people Littman reached out to and made every effort to accommodate use her research is in no way any fault of hers. To which I'd like to end how I started, with another analogy. Those of you familiar with anti-vaxxers likely know they gather online, sharing stories about how family members or people they know suddenly became autistic after receiving a vaccination. If a researcher were to come in and read the posts they were making before conducting a survey which concluded that rapid onset of post-vaccine autism was a real phenomenon in need of explanation and forwarded the hypotheses that vaccines are a likely cause, without making any attempts to even corroborate what these anonymous posters were saying, how long do you think that study would last? It would be devoured in an instant. The researcher would most likely lose any position they had, and the scientific community would have to spend decades undoing said harm. Yet again, I've seen people who consider themselves rational, first of all, defend Littman's study because it questions the current body of knowledge, only to attack those critical of the study itself because if the review finds said study to be deeply methodologically flawed, that will be the misapplication of science. That right there is the pinnacle of special pleading. The idea that the consensus may be thoroughly assessed, but the evidence of this one paper may not. And this of course is forwarded alongside the various claims that the criticism, which has focused extensively on the methodology, is simply the trans cabal lashing out ideologically. The reality, however, remains. Littman's study was poorly conducted and worse, poorly written in such a way that it allows people seeking to harm the general trans community to run off with it and do exactly that. Hi there. I'd just like to say a few things here at the end of the video before you go. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who's ever donated to the channel via Patreon, giving a special thanks to the following people: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, John Schoenrock, Daniel Martinez, and Alexander Williams. Your support has ensured this channel's ability to grow over the years. I'd also like to ask that you comment down below and like this video, as well as subscribe, hit the bell icon, and follow Essence of Thought on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Please also consider following Atheist Alliance International on Facebook, a humanist organisation dedicated to helping atheists around the globe. Lastly, I'd like to request that you treat the people responded to in this video with a reasonable degree of respect. Whilst we understand that there are justifiable limits to said respect when tackling certain heavy topics and anger can be a very genuine emotion in fighting injustice, any comments utilising language which insults others on the basis of perceived gender, sexuality, ethnicity or ability both mental and physical will be removed immediately and the commenter may be blocked on the moderator's discretion. Let's work to keep this space one which upholds the values of humanism. Thank you.